guys, welcome to 2013. We're all alive. And thank you for your support coming today. There's 2 seats here. It's pretty packed today, full house. And hopefully we have enough seats. If not, we'll have to go to the next room where there's nobody and grab some more chairs. So first I want to just mention we have a few more events coming up. Sorry to introduce myself. My name is Michael Chu. We started at Mont again for like a couple. This is our 2nd year, and we're really happy where it's going. And we use meetup.com, which is our Edmonton.net site, and it's kind of like a social site. You know, people can comment on there. We're starting to see people use it. So, you know, I encourage people to use it more. And also it helps, identify people in the community and, you know, and make friends and connect each other. It's not like LinkedIn. It's more about, you know, just learning from each other. If you met someone from the community and you forget their name or something and you want to just connect and learn about more, then yeah, you can do that. So in terms of events, we have February 23rd, Jane Heyman he's a Nokia ambassador developer, and he'll be helping out with Thomas Lewis. He's also a technical evangelist with Microsoft, and he'll be helping out that day on workshop to build any apps that you guys want to build. So, you know, bring your ideas, ask questions. You know, I'm sure a lot of us, including myself, have tons of ideas, just never execute on it. So that'll be the day to bring all your questions, and you have 2 senior, technical guys who can help you really build your app and hope to make your $1 million magic, right? So I have my idea. I'm gonna bring my idea and try to build that day too. So yeah, get ready for that. That'll be on a Saturday, a full-day workshop at Grand McEwen. And March 20, we have Jeffrey McGill with X.net. For those, I've never heard of it, so it's good to get introduction to a new component. There's a chair here now. And that will be on March 20th. And then, and also tonight's part of the food is sponsored by X.net as well. And in April we'll have Curtis Bake. Also a local programmer who is going to introduce us to F#. Also, another growing usage of that language in some ways. So if you want to learn more about it, you can come to that. And that will be on the evening as well. And in terms of today's event, at the end of today's event, we'll have some evaluation feedback. And if you can fill out your name on it, and then we'll do a draw prize. We have some draw prize tonight, some T-shirts, and a couple of books.
2 books. One is HTML5 book, and the other is brand new spunky C#5. That's big.
And we're going to have a camera on top, as you can see. It looks great for that.
Yeah, and if you want to show your face and smile on the camera, you can just kind of hover around David here. And we also have some software license as well, and 3 USB sticks, 16 gigs from Mindscape, and yeah. So that'll be it for the draw prize. So I'd like to introduce David Paquette. He's been here before. Last time he was presenting Windows Workflow Foundation last year. Hopefully some of you guys saw some of the magic. And today he's going to present on NT Framework 5. He's from Calgary. He actually the president of the .NET user group there, and he had worked with many companies, mostly recently at P2 Energy Solutions, and he's the team lead there. With a master's degree in computing science from University of Saskatchewan, and he's very active in the community. So he was at the prior DEF CON presenting the same topic as well. So for those who have been there, probably see that topic before. So welcome, David.
Thank you. Thanks, Michael. So as Michael was saying, I work currently for P2 Energy Solutions, and what we do there is we build commercial applications for the oil and gas industry. So we build software that we sell to customers. Some of that is hosted, some of it is software that we actually ship and gets installed on client machines. So we have a variety of things there, and I'm involved in Calgary in the .NET world and kind of give some direction to the various groups in terms of architecture and also very active in the development of it, so of the various products. So that's what I do for my day job. I do a lot of kind of hobbyist mobile development, I guess, on the side for Windows 8, Windows Phone, and a little bit of Android, but not too much into that side yet. So that's a bit about me. What I'm talking about today is Entity Framework Code First, and of course that's all about getting your data to and from the database, which all of our applications, or most applications that I've built over the years, have that aspect to them. And often we end up spending a bit more time on that than we'd like, as opposed to working on the business functionality that we're actually trying to deliver. So Entity Framework Code First specifically is something that I've been pretty excited about because it really gets a lot of the noise out of the way for you, and it makes it really easy to build your application, to change it as you're going forward. And if we have time today getting into the migrations piece, hopefully, show you how it helps you to manage that change as you evolve the product going forward. So most of the talk today is going to be hands-on coding. We're just going to build an application. But I'm going to start with just a little bit of background, and then we'll get into that sample application. So, who here is using Entity Framework? A few people. Okay. How about it and Hibernate? A few more. How about no ORM at all? A few. Okay.
LLBLGen.
What's that?
LLBLGen. LLBLGen.
Okay. Not familiar with that one actually. I'll have to look that one up. So if you're not familiar with what an object relational mapper is, it's that layer in the software that helps you get the data from your relational database, maybe SQL Server or Oracle, and populating that into your object model, your maybe C# or VB classes, .NET classes. So it manages usually keeping track of when something has changed, when something needs to be updated in the database, doing your inserts, updates, deletes, and your selects. So Entity Framework is Microsoft's object relational mapper. There are a lot of other ones out there, and Hibernate's probably the most popular in the .NET world. I work with Hibernate at work, and some Entity Framework at work. Most of the stuff I do at home is Entity Framework. First came out with .NET 3.5, so quite a while ago. It kind of sucked. Nobody really cared about it. Well, people cared enough to complain about it a lot. I looked at it, wasn't really interested at the time. The first versions of Entity Framework were around, the idea was you use their visual designer, you kind of drag stuff around, you draw the lines between the boxes, you define your relationships using their visual designer in Visual Studio, and from that it would generate a database for you and generate a big XML file and generate your C# classes, so it's doing a lot of code generation for you. You had the other option too, you could do, so that was called the model first. You could do database first, where you would start with an existing database, point the designer to it, and then it would generate a model for you, which you would usually have to tweak a little bit, but it would at least get you going. So that was called database first. In both those worlds, you're working with the designer, and that designer is generating what they call the EDMX file, really big XML file that was really hard to work with. The idea was you should never really need to go into that file, but unfortunately not all the features of Entity Framework are exposed through the designer, and sometimes, unfortunately, you did need to go into that XML file, and then it was just a world of pain. So I had gone down that road a couple times, and enough to know that I never want to go down that road again. So I just stopped looking at it. I wasn't really interested anymore. And then with .NET 4, or after .NET 4, what they did is they actually disconnected the release cycles of Entity Framework from the release cycles of .NET. That was one of the big criticisms. People kept telling the team, if you're going to build an ORM, you need to release it more often than you release the .NET framework, because that only happens every few years, right? You need to move faster than that. So they finally listened, and they did that. They released EFv4 with .NET 4. It was actually their version 2, but with .NET 4 they tried to align all their version numbers. Shortly after that, they followed it up with the release of 4.1, which was their code first version. That's what we're going to talk about today. And that was codenamed Magic Unicorn, which there's usually somebody in the audience who points out that that's redundant because unicorns are already magic. I don't need to say that it's a magic unicorn. It's especially magical. The reason they use this is because it appears to do a lot of things just for you, and until you actually look at what it under the covers and see what it's doing, it feels a little bit magical. But it was a fun command. They had a lot of fun with that one. 4.2 is just a minor patch release. 4.3, they added code first migrations, which hopefully we'll have some time to talk about today. Version 5, I'm not really using too much that's specific to version 5 today, but they finally added support for enums, which is something people have been complaining about a lot. Table valued functions, which I'm not going to use. Spatial data types, which is important if you're doing any kind of GIS stuff. And some pretty big performance improvements. Just right out of the box, you'll see an example of, I'll show you an example of some of the performance improvements just without even doing anything different, just upgrading from 4.3 to 5.0. So, I got excited about it with Magic Unicorn. So we talked about the different varieties. We talked about model first, database first, and finally code first, which is what we're going to talk about today. And in this variety of entity framework, what you do is you start with just the C# objects, or your plain old CLR objects, could be VB.NET if you want. I'm going to use C# in today's demo. You start with just defining your classes and the relationships between them. And then from that, you can generate it. Entity framework can generate a database for you, or you can map it to an existing database. And there is no EDMX file this time. So it's just not there. Now, under the scenes, it's still using all the same code as Entity Framework if you were to do the EDMX version, but it's not driven off the EDMX file anymore. So that big, messy XML file just isn't there anymore, which is great. Just to give you an example of like when I tried database first on one of our existing models for a product that I have at work, I pointed the designer at it. I said, give me a model for this. And about 4 hours later, my computer finally crashed. It never did come back. It just wasn't able to handle it. It was a big database. It was an unusually big, large database, but it just kind of shows you that with the idea of that visual designer in this big XML file, it doesn't really scale all that well. It works okay if you have really small pieces, but in terms of just trying to get going on a small or on a large existing application, it's supposed to work, but it didn't really work that well for me. So we'll get into the sample application. So we're going to pretend today that we're doing a startup. Okay? So everybody in the room gets one share in the company, and then I get the other 999,995. So as minority shareholders, you can question what I'm doing, but as the majority shareholder, I can ignore you. I won't, because I'm a nice guy. So ask questions as we go along. The idea for this application we're going to build is, I'm sure nobody has ever done this before, but it's a website that has recipes on it where people can share them and review them and create groups and join groups. So, totally revolutionary. It's going to change the way people look at recipes, I guess. So, and we're going to start from scratch. So, and then we're going to cheat, but we're going to start from scratch initially. Yeah. So file new project, and what I'm going to do is create an MVC application. So are most people here doing web or thick client development? Show of hands, web. And then like WinForms, WPF, rest. Okay. A little bit of both. Yeah. All right, so we're going to be doing web today. If you have questions about how this would apply to, say, a WPF application, feel free to come and ask me afterwards. So I'm doing a ASP.NET MVC4 application, and I'm using Visual Studio 2012 here, but I'm not using any features that are specific to 2012. Everything that I'm doing today you can do in Visual Studio 2010. Not sure where you guys are at in terms of what versions you're using, but nothing here is specific to the new version. So it's chugging away, creating the MVC application here. Which this takes a little longer than it used to, creating this project. It used to be pretty quick to create it. But one of the reasons it's different now is that instead of the template just including all the packages that it references, it's actually going to NuGet and making sure that it has, you know, the latest versions of things. So they've kind of changed their templating a little bit with 2012 that way. And I think in 2010 as well. So this is just the template application, right? And we'll just modify that to build our social recipe site. So no database yet, we're just talking about a simple application here. We have our contact about, we can log in.
So you mentioned that you went from a database first to a code first way of doing
Yep.
the framework. Was that, and that was just, was it strictly because of you need more flexibility in dealing with that layer, or because of the size of the databases you were using?
I just felt that the other pieces were getting in the way. So as a developer, I understand code. I understand classes and relationships between classes, and I get that world, right? That's what I do every day. I didn't really need a visual designer to guide me through that. So
you feel that though, that you can do the same, you need to solve the same problems just as quick doing code first as opposed to modeling with database first?
I find it's faster
Okay.
with code first, for me. Now, everybody else is going to be different based on their experience and what they're comfortable with.
I know that, like myself, and probably a few other people in here that are, come from a strong database background.
Yeah.
They have that familiarity and comfortable feel when they're using, database first or even model first approach. Going to something like a code first, that I haven't done it myself. I mean, I've tried it, but I'm scared because I think that maybe I'll lose that, knowing how to design a relational database using the designer tools.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me would be quicker than trying to do it from a code first perspective. But as long as you understand the concepts of design of the data, then
it definitely helps to understand the concepts, and that's kind of what some of this demo shows, is how when you don't really understand the concepts, you can get yourself into trouble with this. Mm-hmm. So you might appreciate some of the pieces down the road. And it's always good to have some database people in the room to heckle me for this one, so make sure you do that.
Do they have to be database people?
No. General heckling is just encouraged. Keeps me on my toes. So I'm going to start out, because we're doing code first, I'm just going to start by defining the objects in the classes in my model. And in this model, what I want is, well, we have recipes, obviously, because that's the thing that people want to share. We're going to have users. They're going to be associated with recipes because they post them. They also review them and comment on them. And we want groups, so people are going to belong to groups, and recipes will be shared with those groups. So it's not a huge model, but lots of relationships in between there. Whoa, that's probably going to not work well. So I'll start by just creating a user class.
you manually created that domain folder.
Yeah, I just created that folder. So there's another whole topic around this about, how do you structure your assemblies and how do you do that. If you want to just search for the repository pattern with Entity Framework, there are a lot of examples for that online. I'm just going to focus more on learn the API, that side of it. So user is going to have just two things here. I'm not going to do the user registration piece because that's already existing in the template application. I'm just going to leave that as its own side thing. The user will have an ID, that's the ID that they log in with, and then a name, which is just like their display name. Just to keep it simple. However, they'll also have a collection of recipes. Collection of groups that they belong to. And also some comments that they've posted. It's complaining because, oh, pressed F1. I haven't defined those yet, but we'll get to that. I'm also going to add a constructor here to initialize those collections. So recipes will be a new hash set. So that's my class. It has just a couple of properties that are things we would expect to see in the database, and then the rest is all kind of relationships to other objects. So we'll see how that gets generated into the database in a bit. Let's just define these other, I'm just going to define everything in this one class. Is the text big enough to see? Back? Okay. So I'm not going to make you watch me type all of these out. I have some snippets for those. The next one is the group. So group has an ID. You'll notice that the ID for the user was a string. So I'm saying that a user has a user ID that they log in with. That will be the unique identifier for them. For something like a group, I'm just going to have the database auto-generate an ID for me so that they're all unique. And it has a name, a description, a list of users, and a list of recipes that have been shared with it. Next up is the recipes. So a recipe has, again, groups and comments. So people comment on a recipe. And a recipe is shared with a number of groups. A recipe is posted by a particular user. It's posted on a particular date. We have the ingredients, direction, description, name, ID. And then finally, comment. So comment, again, a database generated ID, the date that it was posted on, the value of whatever it is that the person wrote in, the recipe that they're commenting on, the user that commented. So, any questions on that? No? Pretty straightforward? So that's it for the model. For me, that's easier than creating database tables first and defining the relationships there. And it's also easier than kind of messing around with the visual designer and being all clumsy with my mouse. So that's the model. How do we tie it to a database now? Create another new class here, and I'm going to call it my recipe context. So we haven't even touched any, we haven't referenced anything Entity Framework yet. This is the first place where we do that. I'm going to have this inherit from DB context. And DB context is essentially the API into our database. So it has the generic unit of work pieces built into it. And what I'm going to do is just tell it about my model, the things that I want to store in the database. And to do that is pretty straightforward. We just define some properties, which are DB sets of a particular type. So we're going to have our users in here. We're going to have our recipes. Comments. So those are the 4 things that I want to store in my database, that I want to be able to query, have access to, save them, make changes to them. That's all I need to do. And that's all that Entity Framework Code First needs in order to understand my model, to generate a database, and to get started. So, before we go any further, I'll just show you in SQL Server Management Studio here that I don't have any databases. I'll even refresh it just to make sure that I said I was going to cheat. This isn't where I'm cheating. So, all right. So how do we actually use it now? This is a ASP.NET MVC application. If you're not familiar with that, the main idea is it's kind of an alternative to web forms for ASP.NET development. And the idea is you split your application into 3 pieces. You have your view, which is just how are you going to display the data. You have your model, which is the data that you're going to display, and the relationships between it. So in our case, the model is this recipe context, or the classes inside that recipe context. And then you have your controller, which is, each controller is a C# class that has some logic in it that roughly maps to each method on the controller is a request that comes in from the browser. So when the user navigates to your index page, that gets mapped to an index method on a particular controller in the application. So the logic there goes into the controller. You have your model, that's what your data looks like, and usually has some logic in there too. And then your view that just says how are we going to display it. So what we're going to do is we're going to define our controller and the view for the group, so that people can create groups, and they can go in there and edit groups, delete groups, join groups, all the functionality related to a group. So to do that, I'm just going to go add new controller. Call it my group controller. And I'm going to use one of their scaffolding templates here that has all the empty read-write actions. So it kind of fills out the boilerplate for me. And we're just going to fill in the blanks. So there are other scaffolding options where it actually takes our model and does all the stuff that I'm going to type manually here for us, but it's easier to understand it if you kind of step through it. So we'll start with index, and in this case what we want is we want to pass the view a list of all the groups so that it can display all the groups that are in the system. So to do that, we need to query our context, get all the groups. I start by creating an instance of my context. And to get the groups, all I do is context.groups. I can tell it how I want to order it. So I want to order by the name. That probably makes the most sense. And then I call toArray, which I'll explain in a bit here. And I take those groups and I pass them over to my view. Now, there's one really important piece here. I'm using ReSharper, and it's kind of pointing this out for me that I should be wrapping this in a using. So, if you've done a lot of ADO.NET development, you know that if you don't close your connection right away, the connection doesn't get put back into the connection pool, and you run into connection pooling issues right away. I know I've run into that a few times where you forgot to dispose of your connection somewhere, so it didn't get released and put back into the pool properly. It's the same thing with your database context objects. If you create an instance of a database context, when you're done with it, you have to make sure it gets disposed, because that DB context, when it actually goes to query the database, obviously there's a connection there. So it's the same as dealing with ADO.NET connections. You need to make sure that you dispose of them so that it gets released back. Otherwise, it'll all work fine on your machine, and you'll deploy it, and you'll get 2 users, and it will stop working. So you do need to make sure that I use the using statement, so I don't have to do the try finally and do the dispose myself. That makes sure that when I'm done here, the context is disposed. Now, I'm going to let Visual Studio generate the view for me, because those templated views always look awesome, and that's totally what our users want to see. So I'm just going to tell it that in this view I want to display groups, and I want to use the list template, so it just lists them all out for me. Go add, and it generates a view for me. It's using the Razor syntax, so it's an alternative to the old angle bracket % markup from ASP.NET. A little bit cleaner, easier to work with. It's just a real simple page here. We have a link to create a new one, which we haven't implemented yet. A table here that lists out the names and descriptions of all our groups, and then some some links to edit, delete, and see the details of that. So that's it. Let's run this and see what happens. If I haven't linked this in to the website, there's no way to get to this page I created, but I can just type in the URL directly here. It's just /group/index. So it was the group controller and the index method. So it's thinking. There's my page, there's my create new, and my table that's empty because I don't have anything there. Let's switch over here now and see what happened. So there's our database, or recipe context. You might have noticed that we didn't specify a connection string even, right? It just kind of figured it out, which is great in a development environment. Obviously, in a production environment, you do need to specify a connection string, but it's really no different than the way you used to do that. It's just connection strings with a little bit of extra stuff in there to tell it its entity framework. If we take a look at the tables, you'll see kind of what you expect here. There's our user table with an ID and name. ID is a primary key. We didn't tell it that. It just knew it by convention. So with code first, there are a lot of conventions that are there. And it can be a little bit confusing if you don't know those conventions. You don't know what to expect. But in general, it doesn't take that long to pick up on them. They're fairly logical. Like if you have a property named ID in your class, it's going to assume that that's the primary key. Seems like a pretty safe assumption. If we had named it user ID instead, it still would have figured that out. It would have known, yeah, okay, that looks like an ID. I'm going to make that the primary key.
So is 128 a convention?
128 is a convention for IDs. You'll notice this one is something that the database people love to see, and varchar max.
How about multiple keys?
Multiple keys?
Multiple primary keys.
You can configure that through some of the other APIs. I don't think there are conventions for multiple keys. I usually don't use multiple keys. Like if there are two keys that uniquely identify it, I'll still just throw an auto-generated ID on there, just so that it's a little easier to work with. That's a preference thing. So. And we have things like comments, again, as expected. This time the ID is an int, so it was an integer in our application in the C#. You see the foreign keys here to our so one to the user, one to the recipe. And if we look at this, modify. So if we look at the ID, we can see that it actually set it up as a identity. So is identity yes, and auto increment 1, or identity increment 1, increment seed 1. So again, all by convention. I didn't need to tell it that. It just figured out that you have an integer that's an ID, or if it's a long that's an ID. The convention is it's going to be an auto increment. You can tell it not to do that by overriding some of those conventions. So we also have groups and recipes. Those are exactly as you would expect them to be. But there are a couple other tables here that we didn't define a group recipe or a group user. Right? We didn't do that. So what are these? Well, you remember that a user belongs to many groups, and a group has many users in it. That's a many-to-many relationship, right? So that's how you represent that in a relational model, is you have that intermediary table that has keys for the keys from both of them. And if we look at that, that's exactly what it is. So in this case, that is a multiple key in this case, right? For doing the many-to-many. So the primary key for this is the two of them together, and they're each a foreign key to those other tables. So it defines who belongs to what groups. Likewise with group recipes, because recipes can be shared with many groups, and groups have many recipes. Another many-to-many here. Yep.
How can you tell the entity framework that's a many-to-many relationship? Just because user has a collection of the group and group has a collection of user?
Yeah, it figured it out from that. So user has this collection of groups. Group has a collection of users, and that's all it needs to figure that out.
So if that's the user only has collection of groups, then they figure out it's one-to-many, so they don't have that, right?
Yeah, to get the many-to-many, you need it defined on both sides. Yeah. Now, for it to figure it out by convention, I should say, you can still tell it that it's a many-to-many without having the collection on both sides. And you do that, so it's a good point to kind of show how you extend that. You can do it through data annotations, so you can define it with attributes on the properties. That's one way to do it. Another way is in our context, we can override on model created. So this gets called as it's exploring your model and trying to set up its conventions. This gives you the opportunity to override some of those. So in here I can say model builder.build. Haven't done this part in a while. Model builder.entity. Users. User has many. So if I only had it defined in one place and I still wanted to tell it it's a many-to-many, that's how I would do it. So they built this nice Fluent API here where you can just tell it in what ends up kind of reading like English. So entity user has many groups with many, and because we don't have the, in this case we wouldn't have had the property defined on the other end, we just say with many. Or if it was not with many, it would be with optional, with required. So you can tell it what your ID property is if you don't want to use the conventions that they have for how to name your properties. You can override pretty much anything about the way it generates your database, or if you're mapping to an existing database, this is where you would tell it a little bit about your existing database. The other option is with the data attributes, and you do that. For example, you could tell it that this is a primary key. ID? Key. Yeah, key. So I don't use the attributes very often. Most of the time I'm good with the conventions, and the rest of the time I override in the on-model creating. Again, that's preference. Both are completely valid options.
So also max length, for instance, for strings you put in the override function as well?
Yeah, you can do that here. So if we didn't want the property, has max length, something weird, I don't know. So if I did that, it would generate it as nvarchar 185 instead of max.
So if you run this now, there's already a database with the same context name. What will it do?
It will complain that it doesn't match, that something has changed, which kind of gets into the migration stuff. So we'll hopefully have time to touch on that as well. When you're early on, it's nice because you can just blow away the database and start over again. It would generate it that way. So I'm just going to stick with the conventions for the purposes of this. Okay, so next up is the details. So in this case, somebody's viewing the details for a particular group with a particular ID. Again, we're going to need a context, but instead of doing this whole using recipe context thing over and over again, I'm going to use dependency injection here. So I'm going to say recipe context. So I'm saying that when we have a group controller, when our application needs a group controller, in order for it to work properly, it also needs an instance of a recipe context. Okay? And so now instead of recreating it and worrying about the dispose all the time, I can just reference it directly. And I'm going to use a package called ninject to do the dependency injection for me.
It'll dispose it for you?
Yeah, it's pretty cool that way. So they have some hooks in there for MVC. So the package that I'm going to install is Ninject MVC3.
So that's part of the .NET framework, or is?
No, it's an open source project.
Okay, so
And I'm installing it using NuGet, which is part of Visual Studio. So I just install, it'll download the packages, add the references for me, and add all the setup logic for me. So Ninject on its own is dependency injection. Ninject MVC3 has all the hooks in it for MVC for you. So it goes and it ties some pieces into the app startup and tells it to behave a certain way to inject into controllers. So the default behavior is to, in this case, I'm expecting a recipe context, and the default behavior is that it will create one recipe context, if it's needed, per request that comes in, and it will dispose of it for me when the request is completed. So it handles that for me, and then I don't need to have to remember that I need to do that going forward. So it's a lot less error prone when you do it this way. You don't have to worry about forgetting to dispose of things. And it also scales a little better, because as your application becomes more complex, you might call multiple controllers along the way as you're processing a request. Each of those might require a recipe context. In this case, you're not creating multiple contexts, which has the effect of creating multiple connections to your database, right? So if you do it this way, one request comes in, it might require a context in a lot of different places, but it shares a context, and it makes sure that it's not creating more connections than it actually needs to process that request.
We are on MVC4 right now, right?
I am. There's no difference, MVC3, MVC4, in terms of how Ninject uses it. So, all it did was it added some startup logic here under app start. So it's the one request per HTTP, or one per HTTP request module. That's where it's telling it to behave the way I just described.
Didn't Microsoft implement their own dependency injection?
Yeah.
They did?
There's Unity, I think is that theirs? I can't remember.
Unity.
So I like Ninject. You can use, they all have this kind of stuff. What I like about Ninject with MVC in particular is that they implemented all the hooks for me, and I don't have to configure it at all. So in this case, I want to select a single group that matches the ID that was passed in. To do that, I go groups.single, and I use a link expression here to tell it how to match. So I'm saying, find me the group where the group ID equals the ID that was passed in. So that's all there is to that. That'll do the select for me and pass it over to the view. There are a couple other ways to do this. You can use single or default. Single or default will return null if it doesn't exist. Single will throw an exception if it doesn't exist. This is just a sample application. I'm okay with it exploding. I'm not going to do all the kind of error handling around it. There's also a find method, which just takes in an ID again. A few different ways you can do that, but they all generate more or less the same SQL select from group where group ID equals the ID that was passed in. And again, we're going to generate our view. I'm going to use the details template. So this is just a really simple page here that displays the name and the description and has a link to go back to the index and to edit. So when I run this, again, there won't be anything there. It's empty. Let's just go and add something to the database. I'm going to edit. So there should be one in there now. While I'm here, I'm going to add myself. Because I'm going to need that record there later. Okay, so there should, if we go back and refresh our page, the Edmonton UG should show up here. And it does. There it is. If I click on details, I see the details of it. It's a beautiful application, right? Like, I can't wait for our users to get their hands on this and give us amazing reviews for.
I'd subscribe to that.
Absolutely, right? Okay, let's do something a little bit more interesting. So far all we've done is query data in a somewhat magical way. Next up we'll go through the logic of actually creating a new one. So the create is split up into two parts. There's a get and a post. So the get is, show me the form where I'm going to enter the data. The post is where it goes back to the server when they hit save, and it actually goes and inserts records into the database. So the first one is pretty easy. We're just going to pass a new group. Just going to create a new group and pass that to our view. Again, use the scaffolding to generate that. Probably goes without saying, I'm not advocating that you use the templates all the time, but for the purposes of the demo. This just creates a form for me with a submit button where you can edit the name and the description. Pretty straightforward there. Now when it comes back, try catch. It's for chickens. Okay. So now the group comes back. At this point it will be populated with the data that the user entered in that form. So we have our group object, but it's never been connected to a context at all. How do we tell it to go into the database? Well, this whole context thing, it kind of behaves like just like a collection. You just add and remove, and you select things from it using link extensions. So when I want to insert a new group into the database, I just add it to that DB set. So I say group.add, and to tell the database, the entity framework to save it, I just call save changes. So that's all I need to do to add the group to the database. Pretty straightforward. It's a nice clean API. It kind of removes a lot of that noise from your application in terms of how you work with these things. But I want to do a little bit more there. There's, if I created that group, I suspect that as the person who created it, I probably want to be a part of that group. So I'm just by default going to add that person to the group right away. So I want to get the instance of that user from the database, so the user that's currently logged in. And I'll do that by querying the context again. This time I'm querying the users, where the ID equals user here is a property on my controller, which is the user that's currently logged into the application. And then to get the name of that user, it's identity.name. So that's my login ID. I'm grabbing that user, and I'm going to say user.groups.add. Actually, I'll do it this way. I'm going to go group.users.add user. And then I'm going to save the changes. So if we run this and it all works, I create my group, I would expect to see a new record in my group table, and then a new record in my group users table to define that that user, me, belongs to that group. Let's see if it worked. Create a new one here. There's already an Edmonton one in there, so. I did not log in. Therefore, it crashed because I used single. Should have left it in there, hey?
You didn't protect the create, right? You didn't protect the create, so anyone can do that without the logging. No.
Not right now. It crashes.
Safe now.
It's a built-in feature.
Yep, I did that on purpose. Okay, so there it is. It appears to be in the database. Let's go and actually check to make sure. So there it is in the groups table. Calgary.NET user group. If I look at the group users table, there's the ID for that Calgary.NET user group, and my user ID. So it defines that I am a member of that group. To answer your question on how to protect that, you would throw an authorize. That's all you have to do. So you have to be logged in to do it if you put an authorize. So
Users table separate from the built-in login register.
yeah, I just didn't want to get into that aspect of the application.
Okay,
So I just kept it separate.
Okay.
So in reality, there are actually two databases involved here. There's one that's handling our membership, which was just generated for us by the template. And then there's this one that we're doing the recipe stuff in.
But if you wanted to, you could hook up the users.
Yep.
A separate database?
Well, you can't, from one context to another, you can't really
In a
have the,
separate context.
you can put them into a single context.
Okay.
If you had two contexts and you were trying to point to the same tables, you can run into some issues with that. Can be done, but I'm keeping them separate.
Question about the save changes. Yeah, it seems like it's kind of like a unit work, so you can save
Yeah.
change for several steps. My question about if your change across several pages, does that still work? Like if you do the first page, you do some change, but you didn't save, then you go to the next page, do some more change, but still still is kind of in a session scope. Can you still keep the change? And when you call save change, you will know several changes in different pages.
Yeah, so I'm doing one context per request, one instance per request. You can set it up as one instance per session, at which point you would only put your save at the end of that
Okay, so
that
each
last
page-
part of your dialogue.
Okay, so that's in the request scope.
For me, it's a request scope in this application, but you can configure it to do session scope. If you really want it to scale out, try to stick with request scope though. You're going to get just better mileage out of it if you do that. I know there are times when you need to do session scope, but in general, this works better.
But it supports that, right?
Yes. Yeah. It just affects how it scales out. So that's creating. Editing is also very similar. I consider myself to be a pretty good developer, so I copy and paste a lot.
I'm taking screenshots as you talk.
So edit, again, we're editing a specific group, so we have that ID and we just grab the single group that matches that. And again, just going to generate that view, which works a lot better if you click the right button. Using the edit template this time again, that's just a form. It looks a lot like the create form, identical actually. And then on the way back, this is going to be a little bit different because, what the, it really doesn't want me to delete the try catch this time. So, this time we have our group, it comes back. But because we're doing an instance per request here, the context that we used to initially query that group is gone because that request finished already and the context was disposed of. Not necessarily a bad thing, but we need a way to tell Entity Framework that this group that we're dealing with is one that already exists in the database and it has changed. So if everything was still in scope, it would have detected that on its own. But the way to do that is, again, pretty straightforward. We just say entry for this group dot state equals modified. So that's all there is to that one. Then before I demo that, I'll just do the delete here too. Now, my users are pretty smart and they're not going to accidentally try to delete something, so I'm not going to do like a, are you sure? Let's just delete it, and then we'll redirect them to the index. So first thing we need to do is actually get an instance of that group. So we have to go find it first. Global. See, I should have copied and pasted. And to delete it, all we do is we remove it from our groups DB set, and not too surprisingly, we call save changes. That's our remove.
For the edit, the group itself is still epoch, it's not aware of its context, right?
Correct.
The moment you call the entity function, you link it to context, right?
Yeah. So, yeah, the object, it's at this point, it's just a group object. It has no concept of what it's connected to. When you call entry, you're attaching it essentially to that context. And when I set its state, then it's telling it that I need to do an update for this.
Is there a remove by ID function?
There should be.
Okay. There's not.
Not by default. I think some people have built extensions to do that. And it's a very obvious extension, right? I'm hoping that that makes it into the next one. What really is needed is a batch delete. So not one where you're just giving it a particular ID, but where it's just by a link so that you can say, you know, delete everything that matches this.
Without looking up everyone.
Yeah. So now I should be able to come in here and edit this. It does it changed the value. Changed it here as well. So it did my update for me. It's pretty easy to do. And should we delete Edmonton or Calgary? And I'll delete Calgary. So now it's gone. And it should be completely gone from the database. It is. And remember that I was a member of that group, right? So there was that entry. If I refresh that, it's gone too. So it didn't just delete me. Or it didn't just delete the group, it also deleted the memberships of that group. So there's some default cascading behavior, which can be a little bit confusing to understand. I have a blog post that kind of goes into the details of that. It's really boring.
So how can you handle this concurrency issue?
What concurrency issue?
That means that multiple person try to modify one group, and it's like the first ring or.
I'll show you how you handle it, but I won't actually go through and run it. What you do is you have public, you can do it as a date time or as just an integer, but you mark something as your, let's say it's our last modified.
Yeah, okay.
And then in my context, I did that on group, right? Group. Scott? You mark it that way. You can do that with the attributes as well. And what happens then is when it does the update, it uses that value to kind of guard for it, and then it'll throw an exception saying this value has changed since you since you read it. So it's the optimistic lock-in that it does. I can't remember if there's an implementation of the pessimistic lock-in. I don't think there is, but I've never actually looked into it. So it does that, and then it's up to you to decide how you handle that exception when it occurs.
Can you use SQL Server's row version timestamp field instead of the date field?
Is that a particular column type?
Yeah, it's a special column type in SQL Server that it just automatically increments.
And it's a date time, right?
No, it's an unsigned 64-bit.
Okay. Yeah, so you can tell it, like, instead of it being this, I can make it that type.
It's a bit special because it's a read-only field. It's automatically incremented by SQL Server.
Yeah, so
I think you call it an array of bytes and then data stamp.
Is that what it is?
Yeah,
okay.
the native base type of it is 8-byte array.
Okay. So I have done this before, but it was a long time ago. So yeah, you just don't put a setter on it in your model here. So it's just it only has a getter and a private setter, I guess. I think it was, or protected setter, so that your application can't change it, but Entity Framework loads it in when it loads the object, and then SQL Server kind of handles it from there. So it does tie into it. I have used it. I don't remember the exact syntax though. So you can use datetime or you can use that built-in one. So we kind of covered the basics of our CRUD operations, right? Our creates, our updates, our reads, our deletes. And it was all fairly straightforward to do. Our group controller here doesn't have a lot in it. It's pretty lightweight, right? Not a lot there. So let's flash forward. This is the part where I said I was going to cheat. So I'm not going to build the whole application because that would be incredibly boring for you to watch. But it just so happens that I have a more complete implementation here, where I have put the authorized tokens in, and I'm just going to run this, and it's going to take a little while to get going because I actually created run. So one piece that I haven't talked about yet is this concept of initializing your context, which is a really handy tool for when you're in the development phase or just always as a developer. You need a test database, right, that has certain data in it so that you can kind of try this out and work with it. What I've done is implemented a recipe context initializer. So I inherited from create database if not exists, which is an initializer that's provided by Entity Framework. There are other options here. There's one called drop recreate always, which I wouldn't recommend for a production environment. Because then every time it connects to the database, it drops it and recreates it. It's more useful for maybe a unit testing type environment. In this case, drop database if not exists kind of guards me from accidentally deleting data that I didn't mean to delete. So it's only going to go through here and recreate and populate it if it didn't already exist. So what I did is I created a random set of users. I then created a random group name generator. So I have 100 groups. I have 10 to 15 users, 100 groups, and 500 recipes that I'm randomly creating and putting into this database context. So all you do in the initializer is it passes in an instance of the context, so you just add to it. You tell it what you want in your context, and after it's done, it just saves changes for you. So it's a bunch of code, but it's all just my random generator code, and all it's doing is adding things to the context. It does take a little while, but there it is. So it recreated my database, which is the same model as we were working with before. But now I've seeded it with data because I want to see how this scales. This isn't a lot of users or anything yet, but I want to see how this behaves with some data in it. So we've got our halibut lasagna, our bran stew, always a crowd pleaser, the cod muffins. So I'm on the page here that lists out all my recipes. I have a link to create new recipes, so I can go in here and do that. I can view the details of existing recipes. Best thing about this recipe generator is that the ingredients don't match the title, which also don't match the directions. So it can be a little bit confusing. I can add comments. It just puts a little comment thing down there, so kind of a standard layout. I can go and view all the groups that are in the system. And for each group, I get kind of this little card that says what the group name is, how many members, how many recipes have been shared recently with it. So those are the recipes shared within the last 2 or 3 days. I can't remember what I used. I can go view the details, which gives me kind of the recent recipes here, a list of all the members. And I can click on them, click on a member, see their recipes, you kind of get the idea. All I did here was implemented the rest of the controllers and then applied a bit of CSS styling to make it look like this. But, so nothing magical going on. What I'm noticing is that, you know, there isn't that much data in here yet, but it's already starting to get a little bit slow. Like we're running everything local, this thing should be really fast, right? So groups here, it's taken a long time, like it's hard to see, but it's struggling a bit there before it actually brings it back. So what we're gonna do is add a profiler to this so that we can actually see what's happening. How long are these requests taking, what SQL commands are being executed, so we can start profiling and tuning this a little bit. I'm gonna add another project here using NuGet. And anybody else think that this menu has gotten out of control? It is impossible to find anything in it. I'm going to do it by console. So this one's called Mini Profiler. So Mini Profiler is a tool that was built by initially the folks who did a website you may have heard of called Stack Overflow. So they use this profiler to profile their application, which is probably bigger than anything I've ever built for sure. So it's called Mini Profiler. That doesn't mean it's not powerful. It just means that it's not very intrusive and it doesn't take up a lot of space on your machine. By default, it only does the profiling locally when you're local. You can turn it on in the production environment, but it's intended more for just local use. So there are two pieces to this. I installed that was the Mini Profiler MVC3, and the next one is Mini Profiler EF. So the MVC part doesn't have anything database specific in it, and the EF part is to tie it into Entity Framework so we can actually see the SQL that's running. So those are both successfully added. It downloaded some other dependencies too that were required. It added this file to my app startup, which just tells it what to do to initialize the profiler. There's a bunch of commented out code, which looks kind of sloppy, but it's essentially just telling you what to do. So we're using EF code first. So it's saying use this. So let's do that. It's just initializing the EF part of that. Next thing I need to do is just come into my begin request method here for my application. And I just start it. Stop it when the request is done. And last up, I need to give it a little bit of CSS and JavaScript includes here, so that because what it does is it actually renders the profile information right on the page for me, so that I do my request, I see the results right away. I just need to do Mini Profiler render includes here. So you'll notice the namespace, I guess that's a little hard to read, but the namespace here for the Mini Profiler is Stack Exchange. That's the Stack Overflow guys. They have a whole suite of websites. Oh, thank you. Okay, so now when I come in here, I always ignore the first one because there's, compiling the MVC page and some other things that take a little while. Just ignore the first one, hit refresh a couple times and kind of see what the real number is. There's this number in the corner here. It says 66.4 milliseconds. That's how long it took to render the My Recipes page, which doesn't sound like a lot. But you'll notice that there's an exclamation mark. It's in red. And when I click on that, it gives me a little bit more information on what's actually happening. And it tells me, so I can see, right off the bat, what SQL is being executed. See? mini is a deceiving name because it's super powerful. I can take this block here. It includes the parameters that were passed in. So I can actually take that, paste it into here, use the right database, and see what the query is that's being executed. I can do an explain plan on it. I can start to debug that way. Really easy to jump back into my database tools now. But the interesting thing about this, I mean, that's really cool because that's one of the disadvantages sometimes of using an ORM is you lose that visibility into what's actually happening when it's interacting with the database. But right here, it starts flagging it in red, and it says duplicate query detected. And there's a bunch of those. When I click on them, I see that it's querying for the comments for a particular recipe, and it does that over and over again. So this is the classic n+1 select problem with ORMs, where what I'm doing here is I'm displaying all the recipes for a user, so I query for the recipes for that user. And then what I'm doing is displaying the number of comments here for that recipe. And to do that, I just did, comments.count on the recipe. And what happens is every time I do that for each recipe in my list, it's going back to the database to get the comments. So it's called lazy loading. And that's the default behavior, is that it's going to lazy load your objects. When used naively, this is when you run into performance issues with your ORMs. Very common problem, and there are a few different ways that we can address this. We'll start with the easiest way that will get you kind of to a certain point. So this is my index here for the my recipe page, or the method. And I'm just querying for the user and passing the user's recipes over to the view. And then from there, that's where it's hitting that n+1 problem. But I already know that I need the recipes and the comments. So I can give Entity Framework a little hint so that it knows how to do that. That it knows that I want it all and it just gets it all as one request. What I can do is tell it include recipes. Now I have to do that. That's the name of the property, the recipes collection. I have to do it as a string, but there are extensions in there that you can add so that you can do it with a link expression instead, a lambda expression. So I want all the recipes, and then I also want all the recipes comments. Okay. As long as I didn't make any spelling mistakes, when I come in here now, again ignoring the first one because it takes a little while, spin things up. Give me a chance to drink some water. So you'll notice the red is gone. That must be a good thing. I've been conditioned to think that red is bad. So it used to be 66 milliseconds, and I was doing, it doesn't show them all here, but I was probably doing about 20 queries. It now takes 38 milliseconds, and I'm doing one SQL query. It's a bigger SQL query, obviously. And if you copy and paste that in, you'll see that it's joining the various tables that are needed, the users, the recipes, and the comments table, joining those together, doing it all as one query, getting it all back from SQL Server in one batch and mapping it to my objects. Way more efficient. Going to scale way better if you do something like this. However, in the case of our groups, we're loading a little bit more data in this case. It's an n plus, or 2n plus something problem because I'm doing a lot. I have the list of I'm getting the count of the members and then the count of all the recent recipes. So for each group, I'm doing 2 queries. So for each group, I'm getting the list of users, and then I'm getting the list of recipes. I'm getting to get the count. When you actually think about what I'm doing here, because this list has all the recipes in it, I almost unplugged the projector. I'm actually loading the entire database into memory here. I wouldn't recommend building your application this way because it's not going to scale. We're never going to get to 1 million users if we do it that way. So how can we fix that? Well, this view doesn't need to have all the members in, all the users into memory to get a count, right? Like we can just ask the database for the count of the number of users for that recipe, or for that group, and then we can get a count of all the recent recipes for that group. And I want to do that with one request. There's a way to do that, and it's by projecting the results onto a new class. So instead of just getting the list of groups and passing it to my view here, what we're going to do is we're going to define a new type of class. And this is a class that isn't part of our domain. It's not going to be connected to our context in any way. I'm going to put it in the models folder here. I'm going to go add class group summary model. It'll have the ID of the group that we're looking at, the name, the description, so just the things that we're displaying. We're going to have an int, which is the number of members, and the number of recent recipes. So that's it, just the stuff that we're going to display, not all the relationships between these objects, just the information we need to display on that view. Now on the group view, it used to expect an IEnumerable of group. I'm going to tell it I want IEnumerable of group summary model instead. Get it to include that. So all I'm doing in the list view here is I'm just iterating over it, and then I'm rendering a partial for each group. And that partial is just it's a simple div that just displays those cards that we saw. So again, instead of doing a group here, I'm going to do a group summary model. Easy enough. We were displaying the name, that's still there. We were doing users.count. That was executing one SQL query for each group. Instead, we're going to do number of members. And this was the really ugly one that really never should have been in my view in the first place, because it's kind of a weird place to do it. It was doing the recipes, a count of the recipes where the posted on was greater than 2 days ago. Kind of a weird place to have that logic in the first place. So I'm cleaning up my view a little bit here in the process. I'm just going to do model dot number of recent recipes. We've redefined it, now let's see how we actually tell Entity Framework to generate this super efficient query. Now before I do that, I was talking about earlier about the difference between Entity Framework 5 and 4.3 in terms of performance. When I first put this talk together, it was for 4.3, and this piece was taking 3.5 seconds. So it's still not efficient, it's still doing things in a way that's not going to scale, but you kind of get a sense of how much faster 5 is versus 4.3. I didn't do anything other than upgrade to the latest assembly, and it went from 3.5 seconds to 2.7 seconds. So you get a good performance boost there just by upgrading, which is always nice. Okay, so last up here, instead of just querying for the list of groups, what I'm going to do is it's still going to start out the same way. I'm going to say, get me all the groups, order by name, but instead of just returning the groups, what I'm going to tell it to do is say select. For each group, I want you to give me a new group summary model. So add the reference there. I want the ID to be equal to the ID of the group, the name equal to the name of the group. Description, number of members this is where the users.count thing happens that I was doing in the view previously. And I do need a date time variable here for that 2 days ago. Oh. So same thing as that basically is what I had in the view before. R. So give me a count of all the recipes where the posted on date was greater than 2 days ago. Not sure if I ever got around to explaining the to-array or to-list. When you're interacting with your DB sets and you're adding these link extension methods to it, it doesn't actually go and execute a query until you actually go to enumerate over the results. So as soon as you do like a for each, at that point it will go and execute the query. If you want to force it to do the query at a particular point in time, to ensure it doesn't do the query again if you iterate over it twice, you just do a to-list or a to-array that forces it to actually go and do the query. So, any guesses on how much faster this is going to be? Lots faster? A number? You know, we're 2.7 seconds. What are we going to be? 65 milliseconds. Okay. 80 milliseconds? Less than 100? Yeah, you guys have high expectations. Maybe I'm not going to show you guys. So 2.7. Ignore the first one. 36 milliseconds. So that's a pretty serious improvement, right?
It's in the group, it's just the index.
Oh, sorry. Good catch. 48 milliseconds.
65%.
So you know, it levels out at around 50 milliseconds, and occasionally it's a little different, but it's a big difference, right? And if we look at the query, it's not even as scary as you might expect it to be. I mean, it's a little bit nested, but it's still readable. And as far as ORMs go, this is probably the most readable SQL I've ever seen for doing what we're trying to do. We just took a class that isn't even part of our context. Entity Framework knows nothing about this class. And we were able to do a fairly complex query against our context, map that over in a single query to this new model that just has the information that our view needs. So it provides a lot of flexibility that way. The first implementation there was a little bit naive. We were just kind of interacting with our domain objects right in the view, and we saw how that doesn't really scale well sometimes. We pushed it down a little bit into the controller, defined a new class that was more specific, and with that you're able to build something that can really scale out. So now I'm pretty confident. There's one more thing that we would have to do here, and I'm not going to have time to get through it, but if we really wanted this to scale now, because we're still doing a select everything, like we're not doing a where to kind of limit how many we're getting here. So we're still doing a query that goes against all the groups. If we really wanted this to scale, we would probably do some form of paging here. So we might only display 50 groups and then have a next button to go to the next 50. That's also really easy to do, although I'm not going to. You would just have int page number here that you pass into your index, and you would do a skip page number times whatever my page size is, maybe 100, and then take 100. That's all you would do, and then it would actually only select 100 at a time and kind of walk through the list so that you weren't loading all the groups into memory. So, are we rich yet? Anybody put this up on an app store somewhere and we just automatically got rich? So, we started with POCOs. We learned about the DB context and its API. We didn't specify any connection strings, although you can. And you run the application. That's all you need to do to get started. Used a few different packages here. I didn't have to install Entity Framework because it's automatically referenced for MVC 4. I used Ninject and I used the Mini Profiler. These slides are up on my blog if you want. I'll put up a post with a link to all the sample code too, so that you can look at this if you're interested. Now, there's another part to this talk, which I don't know if we have time. It's kind of up to you guys if you want to hear more about the migrations aspect of it. We can. I won't have time to get through all of it, but I can kind of go through pieces of it. So.
How about we take a quick break?
Sure. Let's do that.
And then for those who want to stay, they can. And I'll hand out the feedback form. So if someone, we'll take a 5-minute break. And then probably do another half an hour talk.
Sounds good.
All right, guys, we're going to start the second half for like about half an hour.
Okay. So this was originally 2 different talks for a conference, so that's why I have it split up this way. But just real quick overview of what Code First Migrations is. It's it's great for it to be that easy to kind of get going, but the reality is once we're there and we need to make changes, that's where things start to get a little bit more complicated. And I've seen a lot of teams kind of get tripped up on this how do we manage the changes in our database. And there are a lot of different options for how you can do that. You can have a DBA that's responsible for it, that just goes and their whole job is just making changes to the database when you need those changes to happen. My experience with that method is that I'm usually waiting on the DBA all the time. And the DBA is always mad at me because I ask for something and then it wasn't quite right, and then I need them to change it again. And then we just start butting heads and ends poorly for the other guy. Code First Migrations is just another piece of Entity Framework Code First that gives us a framework for managing this. It allows us to really quickly make changes when we're early in that development stage of, not early in the product stage, like we might have a very mature product, but a feature request comes into development, we start making changes. It allows us to really quickly manage that. And then when we get to the end of that cycle, it also gives us a really nice controlled way to provide change scripts to push out to production. So we're going to get back into that same sample app. Hopefully it's done initializing here. Yep. Same application, but let's say for the sake of this pretend business that we've started together, it's become wildly successful now. I now have my corner office and you're all working for me as the developers, and I'm just dreaming up new features, right? So I'm there, I'm kind of thinking, how can we make this better? I think it would be really cool if people could click a button to say that they like a recipe. It would be revolutionary. Nobody has ever thought of this. Right? So we need a number somewhere in the database to kind of keep track of this and how many people like this thing, right? So I tell you to do it, and you go and do it, because that's how this relationship works now. So again, we're doing code first. So the first thing you might do is you come into the recipe class, and whether or not you think this is the best way to do this, it happens to be the fastest way. So number of likes. You add a property here. And in the interest of time, I won't go implement the logic around this. We're just going to add the property and then pretend that we implemented the functionality. But we'll say there's a button and it increments a number in the database. And you've implemented that logic, and now you come and run the application. It builds, it goes to connect to the database, and it explodes. And the error that it gives you, I always like to kind of pause here and, whoops, give people a chance to read that error message. It's very rare in software development that we see error messages that are so helpful. It tells us exactly what happened here, right? So the recipe context changed since the database was created. Maybe you should use Code First Migrations. And it even gives you a link to a blog post that explains exactly how to use it.
It's probably dead link though.
What's that?
It's probably dead link though.
No. No, it's live.
Not yet. Not yet.
Tells you exactly how to do it.
Huh.
If all error messages were that easy to work with, they wouldn't need us. So, anyway, so it tells us to try that, so let's give that a try. What we have is an existing database, right? We kind of got our model to a certain point. The database is already there, the model's at a certain point. And now we want to make a change, we're in production. We can't just blow the database away. So first thing we need to do, there are a few commands that you need to learn here, and so it is in a lot of ways a command line tool. There aren't very many commands that you need to learn. The first one you only use once per project, and it's enable migrations. So I do this in the package manager console here. You can do a command line with PowerShell as well. So if you want to automate this in your build scripts, that's what you would use. But I just do enable migrations. And it chugs away for a bit, and then it gives me an error again. And in Entity Framework form, it's a very helpful error message. It's pointing out that I don't know what you mean because there are two contexts in this application. I was talking about that before, how there's the user one and there's the recipe context. So the one that I'm interested in is the recipe context. And it actually even gives me exactly the piece that I need to run, so I just paste that in there. And I enable my migrations. Imagine if Oracle gave us error messages like that. Not gonna happen. Want to bet? So, the configuration with Code First, they've moved away from the concept of having XML-based configuration. They've moved more to like a class that kind of defines your configuration, or using Fluent APIs for your configuration. So all it does to enable the migrations is it creates this class, says this is my configuration for my recipe context. And that just tells it that you're going to be using migrations now. There's some other options. One of them is the automatic migrations. It's set to false by default, so it doesn't do automatic migrations. It's expecting you to explicitly manage your migrations by default. We'll show how to do both. So we enabled the migrations, and it created this migrations folder here in my project. So the configuration class was one of those things that it added. The other one was something called 2013 blah blah blah. That's a unique number based on the date that the migration was created. That's how it knows what order to run them in. And it called this one the initial create. So because the database already existed, it recognized that, oh, you want a database, you want an initial create script that's going to create it at that point. So it doesn't have this number of likes in it yet. That's not there. So this is the way the database exists today. So this is getting us to that point if we ever need to recreate it. So it's a Fluent API again. Each migration has two methods, an up and a down method. The up brings you to this version, the down brings you to the previous version. So in this case, it's just creating all the tables as they exist today. So we have ID, which is a string. It has some configuration here in terms of its length and everything. And we tell it what the primary key is. So the nice thing here is that it generates this part for you, but then you can extend it to say what you want. So somebody was just asking me about, what if there's another unique key that's kind of my business key? It's not my primary key for the table, but I do want it to be unique. So users is a really good example of that. I would also want the name probably to be unique. So if I can remember how to do this. Yeah. So I can also define a unique index to tell the database and enforce a constraint there that the name is also unique for that table. So this was something you couldn't do with Entity Framework Code First previously. You can only do this using migrations. There were like really hacky ways to do it, but you can do it efficiently.
You could do it in DB context.
You could override and you could inject SQL into your
Not
things.
SQL, you could actually, you had actually the unique and this is an index on your before created the override that you put down there, you could actually do it in that.
So this provides us a little bit more flexibility though in terms of options. So it's a Fluent API and it's fairly easy to just kind of explore it and learn what you want to do. If you want to define additional foreign keys, you can do that too. And you're doing this now, you're defining it at the database script level. So what Code First Migrations does when it goes to run these is it will actually generate SQL scripts to go and apply those changes to a production or a database that already has data in it without wiping your data out. So it's just creating the tables with the columns to get a set first point. The down is, not surprisingly, dropping all of those. So it just gets rid of it all.
So on those unique indexes, if you actually violated the constraint, what, it's enforced in the database, but does any framework know about it, or is it just in the database?
Just in the database at this level. Okay, so that gets us to the point that we were at before we added the number of likes. Now we want to add that new piece. So this is the second command. It's add migration. So I'm just explicitly telling it that I want to define a migration for the change I made to my model. It tells me you need a name. You need to give it a name. So I'm going to say add number of likes. Chugs away for a little bit. Creates a new migration for me where it says add column, number of likes to this table, make it an int, and it is nullable false. If I had defined it as an int, a nullable int in the model, it would be a nullable int here.
How come it didn't, maybe I missed it, how come it never asked you for the context this time?
That was only for the enable migrations piece. So now that I only have migrations enabled for one of the contexts, it knows which one I'm talking about.
So you changed the context, like you opened a different solution or whatever, and you enabled it there.
It's scoped to whatever project you have selected. And if you have multiple contexts with migrations enabled, then you would have to specify which one you were talking about.
So how complex can your database be? How complex can the changes be for it to be automatic when you actually collect it in scripts?
As long as, so there are two pieces. There's the changes to the schema, right? Just the changes to the tables and the relationships between them. It handles that part for you. The other part is, they call it data motion, where you're actually moving data from one place to another. That's a little more complicated, and you can't do that. You have to actually fall back into writing SQL, and I'll show how you can do some of that too. So it handles the changes to the model, but not the movement of data between. So. Okay, so it generated that for us. To apply it now, this is the third and final command that you need to learn, is update database. And I don't have to give it any parameters, it's just update database, and it will apply that change to my database now. So it should go and add that column. So it did that. If we look at our recipes table, there's my number of likes. Pretty straightforward. So,
sorry, where did you define the default value for the non-nullable column there? It just says nullable is false.
well, here it's an int, so it's just going to be 0.
Okay.
When it's so it's part of the API. Default value. So you can give it a default value that's just a string, or default value that is a SQL that gets executed, or a CLR default value. You have a lot of options there. Good question. So maybe I screwed that up and that's not what I actually intended to do, and I want to go back to the way it was before. So I can use update database again, and I can tell it, I can. So I can do update database, and I can tell it to target migration initial create. So that was that first one it created. And when it does that, it recognizes that it needed to revert the add number of likes migration. And if we go to our database, refresh our column list, we see that that's gone now. So really easy to kind of go forward, back, iterate over it locally. When you're happy with it, then you can check in that migration. Other developers on your team, then they do update latest to get the latest code, and all they have to do is jump into the command line, do update database, or maybe you script it as part of your update scripts, but they just go update database. Their local instance is now up to date as well. So I think that makes for a nice, clean workflow in terms of how you manage these things, but obviously this is a very simplistic change. Before we jump into a slightly more complicated change, I'll show how the...
So what will you use in the production? Like what you're doing locally?
Yes, so when you want to go to production, and maybe, you know, developers shouldn't touch production, and that's the way your place works. then what you do is you say update database source migration is the initial create. So you explicitly tell it what your start and endpoints are. You go target migration, add number of likes. Or if you don't tell it, it just automatically goes to the latest one. And then you do dash script. Getting late in the night. Forgot a dash there. This is not as nice of an error message, by the way. So this time what it does, instead of applying the changes to a database, it just dumps it out to a script file for me, right? So it's just a, keep hitting the wrong one. It's just a standard SQL script, alter table. There's your default value of 0. And then there's this other line that's saying insert into __ migration history. We haven't talked about that yet. That's how it keeps track of what changes have been applied to a specific database. If we look at our database here, and they hid this under system tables so it doesn't kind of add noise to your standard application tables. But they have this simple table here. It's just three columns. One is the migration ID, so that's the name of the class that implements that migration in our code base. The product version, so that's the version of both Entity Framework and .NET. I don't know why it needs to know that, but probably to make sense of this model one, which is binary data. So that's a hash that they use that is kind of a clever way of keeping track of the state of your model. So the classes and the properties on it and the relationships between them. It stores that in there so that it can tell what the state is of that database. So the way when you do an update database, the way it knows if it needs to apply a migration or not is by checking in this table. And then when it's applied, they just insert into that table. It's pretty straightforward, really.
If you do data annotations or on-model create changes in your database, will the migrations detect that?
Yes.
They will.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I try to decide which other example to go through here. I have a really complicated one, which I'm not actually going to have time to do. But let's say we want to add the concept of a rating. So this is a whole new, actually I'm not going to have time to get through all of that. So I'll show you the automatic migrations part of it, which is, I'm just going to blow away this change. So let's pretend that we didn't do this explicit migration for the add number of likes. I'm just going to delete that. So it's not in sync. There's no migration defined for this yet. My database doesn't have that number of likes column. I can come into configuration here and I can say true. Automatic migrations enabled true. Now I can come in here and say update database to tell it to update to the latest. So just update database, enter. So it applied an automatic migration here. So this isn't one that we defined anywhere. It just applied it automatically. Oh, I keep hitting the wrong. So if we query this table now, there's my automatic migration. And my recipe contains the number of likes. So where I like to use automatic migrations is maybe enable it for the purposes of I want to make all my changes. I don't know if I'm done yet, so I don't want to define my migration. Just let it do the automatic part for me. And then when I'm done working on my feature, I'm happy with the state of the model, I'll tell it roll back to where I started. So get rid of all these automatic migrations. Now add the explicit migration and define the explicit migration at that point, so that you kind of do the migration at the end when you're done working on the feature. Let the automatic part handle it for you.
Does it actually store the file as well for automatic migration?
No, there's no file, so that's why it doesn't work. You wouldn't want to check in with automatic migrations, probably. There might be a use case where that's valid, but I would probably avoid that. So now if I go to roll that back, so that case where I need to go back now, I'm going to tell it to target the initial create again. I'm going to get an error message, I think. So it recognized that it needed to revert that automatic migration, but it said, I'm not going to do that because it would result in data loss. So by data loss, they don't mean that it was going to delete some rows that maybe had some data in it. They're saying there's a column there that we're going to delete. We don't think it's safe to delete it because we don't know what that column represents. It might be important information. So you can tell it, you can configure it to enable or allow data loss. And you do that by saying automatic migration data loss allowed equals true. So. And once I do that, then I can roll it back. So I hope that gives you a bit of an idea of the workflow of how you could use this. Now, we didn't get into the data motion part. The example I had was that, in here, I have my descriptions and my ingredient, or my directions and ingredients just in a big string field, which, you're all my employees now, and you're swearing at the guy in the corner office who designed this database because that was pretty stupid. Because if you want to search by ingredients now, or if you want to do adjustments for the size of the recipe overall, like I want to do a double recipe, you can't do that because look at how awful this table is. So ingredients is that, which is not convenient at all. So the other example that I have that I don't have time to go through is where we split the model up so that we have recipe ingredients and recipe directions, and we take the values out of those columns, pivot them, put them into the new tables. We don't lose any of the data, and we do it all through the code first migrations. I'll just show you the piece that that's important to that, because in terms of creating the new tables and everything, it does it all through the migrations piece when you do add migrations. But the part of actually moving the data around, that's where you have to get into writing SQL again. So you can't avoid it all the time. And maybe you're good at it anyways, so why not? But the way you do that is in between whatever steps you need to do it in your migration here, you just go SQL. My awesome SQL script goes here. Actually, I can show you what my script looked like. So that's my script for splitting it out. But you can do that, right? You just embed it in there, and then it becomes part of your migration script. That's all there is to it. There's really nothing magical about it. What I like about it, though, is that it gives me a controlled, repeatable way to manage my database changes. It allows me to work on my changes locally, promote them, check them into source code. All the other developers get it. They can apply their migrations. We know that our databases are in sync and we're not fighting with that, oh, you didn't get this database change problem. So now, just a couple last things on that. So 3 commands: enable migrations, add migration, and update database. That's all you need. There are different flags on that you can use, like the script one to do your production scripts. What you can do with that is have when you check in, then you can have your build process generate your change scripts that then get published out for your production, your push out to production, as an example. We talked about schema changes versus data motion, automatic versus explicit migrations. So I showed you the initializers in the last part, the create database or drop, recreate, always. There's one that they added with the migrations piece, which is migrate database to current version. So this one's kind of interesting because then when it starts, instead of crashing like it did and giving that really nice error message, as nice as it is, I don't want to see that all the time. In your development environment, you could actually configure it to say, if there's been a change, migrate to the latest version automatically for me, so that you don't even have to do the update database command. Again, wouldn't necessarily want to use this in production, depends on your situation. But you can have the application automatically apply the migrations at startup time and when it detects a change to the database. So that's pretty cool, pretty powerful, and kind of an interesting way of using it. Didn't use any special packages for this, so it's just Entity Framework as it exists if you were to install it with NuGet today. But maybe you're not using code first and you still want to do this kind of migration stuff. There are some other options. There's Fluent Migrator, which has kind of fairly broad database support. It does SQL Server and Oracle. You have to define your migrations explicitly, but they're defined kind of in the same way as those code first migrations were. It just doesn't have that add migration piece that detects the changes for you. So you're doing it more manually. And then there are other packages like db deploy where you just define your change scripts, like write them in text files and SQL files, and then you use db deploy to kind of manage the update database and making sure that everything's in sync. So there are other options if this is something that your teams have struggled with. So I'd encourage you to take a look at it. And that's it. So that's the abbreviated version of code first migrations.
Does anyone have any questions before we do the drawings?
Can you look the migrations into Microsoft deployment stuff?
Yeah, so Web Deploy does these.
Any more feedback?
You can, I haven't done this, but you can configure Web Deploy so that when your package goes up to your staging server, your production server, or Azure, it actually just it executes your migrations for you. So it's part of like the publish out to whatever server you're going to through Web Deploy. It will apply these migrations for you, which is pretty cool.
Can we use Oracle for that?
I tried using Oracle, like I tried really hard. Because I really wanted it to work. Like, I really did. So Oracle does their own providers, and they're really, really bad. I just stay away from it. The Oracle Entity Framework providers are just so far behind. And you go on the forums and you try to sort it out and ask the questions, and Oracle blames Microsoft. And it just turns into this pissing match, and I'm really not interested in taking part in it in any way. So you can, it doesn't work very well with the Oracle providers. There are other providers that you can buy, like commercial ones that you pay for. DevArt has one that is pretty good, and you can use it. So I haven't used the DevArt one I evaluated the DevArt one for Oracle, and it worked pretty good. So if I were to do it again, that's what I would use. You can do this with MySQL, and the provider is free, which is kind of funny because it's the same company. So they managed to do a pretty good MySQL provider, which is free, and then Oracle, which is the one you pay for, doesn't work. That's been my experience with it anyway.
I presume there's a way to tell the Entity Framework to use, let's say, store graph for running operations.
Somebody else said
Single
earlier.
or add those methods.
Not for code first. I can't remember what the state of that is for the other flavors of Entity Framework. If you're doing that type of data access, Entity Framework might not be your best bet. I might go with something simple like Ibatis, or maybe something like an Hibernate, personally.
One question I have, how does this work with like source code control? Is that
The migrations piece?
No, actually the whole code first.
Well, everything's just a C# class. So,
I mean, if you have a large team, some people code may not be updated properly, right? May not get the latest code or whatever.
Well, if they're not getting the latest code, so I guess the place where you might have problems is if you have 20 developers pointing to the same database.
Right.
I would recommend not doing that, because that's when you run into problems. So then you run into problems too, because I might be working on a change, I make a change to the database, and I break it for everyone else, right? So the way I try to set up my teams is I have a local database instance for each developer that they work on, so that then, and that's where these migrations pieces come in really well, because you get the latest source code, you call update, it migrates your database to the latest version, you know it's in sync with the code. And if you don't update for 2 weeks because you're on some crazy refactoring tangent, you're unaffected by any changes that other people make, because your database is in sync with your code. I know that's a challenge sometimes with some databases, but What we've done, the project we're working on right now, it's a pretty big database. Like we're talking 1,800 tables, which is why Entity Framework, the designer, crapped out on it. It's not a great model. It's a bit maybe not well designed, but we were previously working all developers against one database, and recently what we did is we shrunk it down to a smaller reference database that the developers can use that doesn't have like the full data set in it, and each developer is pointing to their own instance, and it works a lot better for us that way.
There you go.
Any more questions?
One more question. So how would I guess the migration get handled if you have multiple developers and then they have those ad migrations? You know, they're doing those ad migrations.
Yeah.
How would they get in sequence?
Hopefully they don't depend on each other, and there isn't a lot of overlap.
You still want to
So
be able to.
the thing is, but as a developer, before you check in, you should update and make sure everything works locally, right? So the time overlap of like 3 people's changes getting in at one time, that shouldn't happen very often unless you're talking like 600 developer team. I think for most realistically sized teams, as long as the developer does an update before they check in, so update and compile and make sure that everything still works before they check in, you won't run into a lot of problems. What happened to me recently was I had one of these really big migrations that took me a couple weeks to do, and it was not fun. But I started out and my migration was tagged as being 2 weeks ago, and then I get to the point where I'm ready to check in, and 5 other people have done migrations since then. So I update, I see they've done migrations, but I want my migration to happen after theirs. I just changed the time code on mine to be the current date, so the time that I checked in as opposed to the time that I actually created it. And then they happen in the right sequence. That's how I've handled that.